Last week, we studied the parable of the great banquet. And as part of that parable, somebody gives a banquet, people make excuses why they can't be there, and he goes out and he has the hall filled with people who weren't originally invited, but that accepted the invitation. Many people feel that the parable that we're going to talk about tonight is actually part of that other parable. But there's every indication that it was, in fact, a separate parable. They're about the same illustration, but probably given at different times in Jesus' ministry. It's kind of like a preacher using the same sermon on several different occasions. It's not always exactly the same. Sometimes circumstances come along and it switches it a little bit, but you may recognize it, but at the same time, there's some differences as well. So that's what Jesus does on this particular occasion. Let me ask you, how would you feel if you gave a black tie dinner? Now somebody said, what? Okay, a black tie dinner is where the men are expected to wear tuxedos or at least suits, and the women evening gowns or what have you, okay? So if you gave a black tie dinner and people showed up and they were in their tuxedos, they were in their suits, they were in their evening gowns, but there was one person that came and was dressed in sweats. How would that make you feel? How would you feel toward that particular person? Well, if you want to open up your Bibles to Matthew chapter 22. Matthew chapter 22. This parable of the wedding garment, or lack thereof, as the case may be, it sounds a bit on the harsh side, but really it's not. In fact, it is teaching us some very important lessons. If you would follow as I read Matthew 22, 1 through 14. And again, Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son. And he sent his servants to call those who were invited to the wedding feast, but they would not come. Again, he sent other servants, saying, 'Tell those who are invited, see, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding feast.' But they paid no attention and went off, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his servants, treated them shamefully, and killed them. The king was angry. Excuse me. The king was angry, and he sent his troops and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. Then he said to his servants, 'The wedding feast is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore to the main roads and invite to the wedding feast as many as you find.' And those servants went out into the roads and gathered all whom they found, both bad and good. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to look at the guests, he saw there was a man who had no wedding garment. And he said to him, 'Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding garment?' And he was speechless. Then the king said to the attendants, 'Bind him hand and foot and cast him out into the outer darkness, where in that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen.'" Verses 1 through 10 are pretty much the same parable that we looked at last week. So I want us to instead focus on verses 11 through 14. Okay, again, 1 through 10, there are some differences to the parable we looked at last week, but it's pretty much the same story. So in verses 11 through 14, it sounds like a very cruel and heartless king threw a bum out of his banquet. Well, that's kind of sort of exactly what happened, but not without proper provocation, and we'll see that in just a few minutes. The man wasn't prepared for the feast. There are two types of lessons I think we can learn from this story. One is a type of local lesson, and the other is a lasting lesson. Let's begin, though, by looking at the local lessons, and there are two of them, I think. The first of them is that legalism is a wasted effort. Legalism is a wasted effort. There are some who look at this parable and apply it to the way that we dress when we come to church. that we should all be dressed in a certain specific way. And if we're not, then somehow our worship is not acceptable to God. I'm not one of those type of people, simply because I know that God is more interested on what's inside of us than on what we're wearing on the outside. But some who do that, and they see the idea of wearing proper clothes as being legalistic. You know, you have to do that. It's just what you have to do. Matthew is actually the only gospel that records this parable. Again, Luke has a similar parable, Luke 15 through 24, that we looked at last week. But Matthew is the only one that has this specific parable. Matthew is a gospel that was written to the Jewish people. The Jewish people had a legal code, the law of Moses. And their life had become one long effort to keep the law. And if they kept the law, then they get to go to heaven. If they failed to keep the law, then they would not go to heaven. Pretty much that was the way it was. Well, Paul actually argues against this type of thinking in passages, such as the entire letter to the Galatians. It's about the futility of keeping the law if you don't have God's grace to make up for the shortcomings. But don't misunderstand that means that we can do whatever we want and God's grace is going to cover everything. That's not what Paul talks about in Galatians either. And in fact, he doesn't talk about that in other places either. Romans 6 verses 1 and 2, Paul writes, "What shall we say then? Shall we go on sinning so that grace may increase? By no means. We died to sin. How can we live in it any longer?" So I think what Jesus is saying here in Matthew is that unless we strive to conform to the standards of God that He set, then we're wasting our time. Now again, that doesn't mean that we approach it with a legalistic attitude, that God gave all these check marks and we got to go through them and make sure we got them. That's not what He said. I'm talking about making an effort. If we're making the effort, then God's grace will make up for our shortcomings. So legalism is a wasted effort. The second local lesson, though, is that love is not a wasted effort. You see, you can't just try to be good because of punishment if you're bad. I mean, that's the legalism talked about. And by the way, not being bad is not the same as being good. For some people, they take it like that. For example, someone may say, well, you know what? I never killed anybody in my entire life. Okay, so that's not being bad. But have you put the needs of others ahead of your own needs? That's being good. See, there's a difference in just not being bad and in being good. See, motivation is the key question. In 1 John, John writes, there is no fear in love, that perfect love drives out fear, and that God is love. So we can't just not be bad because, or can't be good just because we'll be punished if we're bad. That's the wrong motivation. We can take an analogy from life. Think about the parable as being about the clothes that we wear. Not necessarily to church, okay? But just in general life situations. For example, if you violate the law and you receive a ticket from one of our fine, upstanding police officers, and you don't believe that you did what that police officer said that you did, then you would probably go to court to fight the ticket. When you go to court to fight that ticket, how are you going to dress? Are you going to wear shorts and a t-shirt and just have the appearance that you really would rather be somewhere else, anywhere else except there? Of course not. You're going to dress pretty nicely, or as nice as you can, because that's what's expected. It's almost a legal obligation that you dress a certain way to appear in court. On the other hand, let's say that you are going to go out on a date, or you're going to go out with your spouse. That really shows that you're really in love there. You take your spouse out. That's really good. A good thing to do, guys, by the way, just so you know. That's my marital advice for tonight. Anyway, so you go out, and when you go out on this date, how do you dress for that occasion? Do you look as sloppy as possible? No. You want to look as attractive as possible. Why? Because you're obligated to? Oh, no. You want to look as attractive as possible because you love the other person. Do you see the difference in the motivation? Going to court, you're obligated to dress one way. Going out with the one that you love, you dress that same way, but simply because you love that person and you want to be at your best and you want to look your best. So the local lessons, legalism is a wasted effort. Love is not a wasted effort. Let's move on to the lasting lessons now. There are 3 lasting lessons, and they all come from the man that was cast out of the wedding banquet. And they all center around his problems that he had. Okay, the first problem that he had was he had no sense of the fitness of things. Okay, if he had any sense of the fitness of things, then he would not have shown up at a royal feast in inappropriate clothing, in rags. He just wouldn't have done it. If you travel abroad and you go into some of the famous cathedrals in Europe and things of that nature, you may notice that a lot of the times, even the noisiest of kids will quiet down when they get into that cathedral. It's almost as if instinct tells them that that's not appropriate for that particular situation, that setting. And the atmosphere instinctively tells them what is fitting. We should know instinctively what is fit for the presence of God. And also, we should know that God is not confined to a church building. That God is everywhere all at once. And we are continually in His presence. So when somebody comes up to me and says, well, did you see what so-and-so was wearing at church the other day? And how horrible it was? I say, well, God isn't just at the church building. He's everywhere. And so it matters what you wear to church, but it also matters what you wear every other time you get out of the house. And I actually had somebody do that. A lady was complaining to me about the way somebody was dressed who was leading singing that Sunday or something like that. This was like on a Tuesday or whatever. And she really wasn't dressed to be complaining about how other people were dressed. She wasn't wearing the most modest of clothing, and we'll leave it at that. But and it wasn't because I went and visited her in her house either, okay? This was out in a store or something like that. The point is, God is everywhere, and it's important how we dress everywhere that we go. Now, don't misunderstand. That doesn't mean that we can't have fun. God loves joy and laughter. John chapter 10, verse 10 says that Jesus says that He came that we might have life and have it to the full, have it more abundantly. Abundant life is a fun-filled life. We just need to be certain that the fun that we are having is fitting and proper for the presence of Almighty God. So the first lasting lesson, he had no sense of the fitness of things. The second problem this man had was that he had no sense of what was going on. Maybe he didn't realize that he was being invited to a wedding feast. Maybe he just wanted a free meal. He had no thought, apparently, of joining in the tribute to the king or to the king's son. He was just sort of thinking about, well, what can I get out of this? How is this going to benefit me? How am I going to have the most fun? And so he had no thought, no sense of what was really going on. I'm sure all of us know people kind of like that, who when times are tough in their life, they show up at church. But as soon as things start getting better, you never see them in the doors. But then if things start going bad again, they start attending again. I know of a guy, the first place that I preached at, he was a very heavy smoker. And he was diagnosed with cancer. And for about 6 months, he never missed a service at church until he was put into the hospital for treatment. The treatment was successful. He got out of the hospital. We didn't see him for a couple of years. Until, guess what happened? The cancer came back. And so did he. And, that's not the type of Christians that God is after. That's somebody who has no sense of what is really going on. There's some examples of this from today, from our world today. If you go to a ballet, you'll enjoy it more if you know something about the story of the ballet, about the characters in the story, about the emotions and the motivations that are involved. Now, for example, it's the holiday season. The Nutcracker is a big ballet. It helps if you understand that the Nutcracker is not about pecan pie. Okay? When you go and see it, it really does. Okay? It helps. Okay? You'll enjoy it more. The same is true with athletic contests. It helps if we know the rules and have an appreciation of the game. And whether that is football or basketball or baseball or soccer or whatever, badminton. I remember watching the Winter Olympics, several Winter Olympics ago, and saw these guys sliding rocks down a sheet of ice. It's called curling. And I was like, that's the dumbest thing I've ever seen. But you know what? The more I watched it and the more I investigated and found out the rules, I found that's a pretty tough game to play. And we need to respect the people who can do that sort of thing. It's not just slamming into the other players' rocks and things like that. But anyway, it helps if you have a knowledge of the rules, to have an appreciation of the game. The same is true about church. When we come to church services, we need to have a sense of what is really going on during the services. And how do we do that? Well, it means we don't allow ourselves to be distracted by other things that are going on. A lot of people, they use the Bible on their phone. That's not a bad thing, okay? If you use it, that's great and everything. But I've noticed that sometimes when I'm using the Bible, it's on my phone, I'll get a text message. And I'll just instinctively hit that text message and start replying. And I think, wait a second. I'm not supposed to be doing that. I'm supposed to be paying attention to what that guy's saying. So, you got to be careful and be sure that you're not distracted so that you have that same appreciation and you have a sense of what is going on. The man thrown out of the banquet had no sense of the fitness of things. He had no sense of what was going on. And finally, he had no sense of reverence or respect for the king. See, reverence is an awareness of the greatness of the person in whose presence we are. When we worship God, we are in the presence of God. Romans chapter 12, verse 1 says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship." Our lives are our rational, sacred service to God. Our lives, we're to sacrifice in service to God. That reasonable service is to render religious service or homage. And it's remembering that we are never out of the presence of God. Never. There's a guy in the Old Testament who learned this lesson, we might say, the hard way. His name was Jonah. You remember what Jonah tried to do? He tried to run away from God. What did he find out? You can't do it. He found out the same thing that David knew when David wrote Psalm 139, verses 7 through 12. He says, "Where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light about me be night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is bright as the day, for darkness is as light with you. We can't escape the presence of God. So we need to understand that. Sometimes people will stand at attention when the national anthem is being played. And that's good, and I think we need to do that. Don't misunderstand me. But while they'll stand at attention for the national anthem, they'll sort of slouch when we're singing hymns to the Creator of the universe. I mean, if there's ever a call for reverence, it's that time is when we need to be reverenced. Respect for the King is doing the best with what we have. I remember growing up, I had Sunday clothes and I had every other day clothes. That was just the way it worked. And I distinctly remember one time, my brother, sister, and I decided we were going to play church. And guess what I got to be? I got to be the preacher. Isn't that exciting? Anyway, but so I decided I was going to go put on some Sunday clothes. Well, my mom saw me in the Sunday clothes, and she said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, we're playing church, so I wanted to dress my Sunday clothes." She said, "No, play like you're in your Sunday clothes, okay? You don't need to." Because, anyway, so, but having respect for the King is doing the best with what we have. And for Sunday clothes, if they're best Sunday clothes or whatever you want, then that's fine. Singing is another hot topic in this regard. Some people just don't want to sing. They say, "Well, I can't sing," and that's the problem. I don't want to embarrass myself. I don't want for people to be looking at me and focusing on how bad I'm singing and things of that nature. And so, I don't ever actually sing during church services. Well, our singing may not be on key, but what's important is that we're doing our very best. I interviewed for a job one time at a place in San Antonio, and I remember distinctly because we were sitting there, and on Sunday morning we started singing, and I heard this guy singing, and he had some issues mentally and everything. He was slow and everything. But he was just singing as loud as he possibly could. And he was nowhere close to the right key. And he was either 7 words behind or 25 words ahead. Okay? But that boy was putting everything he had into his singing praises to God. And that's what we're talking about here. It's about putting everything we have, doing the best with what we have. John 4:24 tells us that God is spirit, and his worshipers must worship him in spirit and in truth. The outside doesn't matter to God. What God's after is your heart. And if your heart is right, then everything else will be right as well. Since he had no sense of the fitness of things, no sense of what was going on, and no sense of reverence or respect for the king had no alternative but to throw him out. Now that seems a little harsh if you think about it. It seems cruel. But you know what? As a king, he had a right to expect certain things from the guest that he invited. And some people say, well, but still, if he was wearing the best clothes that he had, the king should have understood that and should have let him stay, except for the slight bit of information that the king himself would have provided those guests that needed it with appropriate clothing, if they needed it. This man would have been given the opportunity to be dressed by the king for the banquet. And he refused to follow the king's instructions. And so therefore he was thrown out. You see, this man just simply failed to put on the provided clothing. One general lesson we need to learn from this parable is the necessity of preparing ourselves to come into the presence of God. Now I know, while we are always in the presence of God, I get that as we live our lives. But when we assemble as a congregation, we are collectively approaching the throne. And we need to prepare for this. And again, I'm not talking about clothing. Too often, we leave the house at the last moment, with just barely enough time to get there. And then there's traffic, and then there's something happening, and we get caught by every red light, and we're getting more and more anxious about getting there on time, and how embarrassed we're going to be because we're going to be late, and this and that and the other. So we rush down the road and arrive without any preparation at all to approach the throne of the Creator of the universe. And we wonder why, when we leave, we can't figure out why we even bothered to show up. You know, we're thinking about resolutions, or at least you should be. We're about to start a new year. Maybe one of our resolutions needs to be that we're going to take a little bit of time before we come to church to prepare ourselves for the assembly of the saints, to spend some time thinking about what it is that we're about to do. Maybe that will help us. But you know, there's another coming into the presence of God that we must prepare ourselves for. That coming into the presence of God is something that's going to happen at any moment. It could be tonight, it could be 30 years from now, we just don't know. But that coming into the presence of God is the day of judgment. If you're not prepared for that day, then there's really not much else that matters. Or at least it shouldn't matter to you, except getting prepared. Maybe you're prepared. Maybe you're not sure if you're prepared. Maybe you took that initial step. You were baptized into Christ and everything. But since that time, you sort of have been a little bit iffy in your commitment. Make things right between you and God. If that involves a private response, then privately respond. If that involves a public response, why don't you come to the front now as we stand and sing together.